Hello. We are very honoured to be joined by Henry and Rob, who are the directors of the film. First of all, thank you for a really beautifully made, very, very powerful film that clearly was very harrowing to make and required a lot of work and a lot of shooting, I'm sure, as well. I guess my first question is Mladić really still very much a hero after the verdict?
I think that one of the things that was a kind of surprise to us is the extent to which there's a huge division in Bosnia, and there's a huge division when it comes to perception of Mladić as well. And I think for the victims, he's a monster. He's a terrible person, and for many people, he didn't deserve the 5 years of due judicial process that we documented in the film. But on the other side, amongst the Serbs, particularly in the Republika Srpska, which is the Serbian state in Bosnia, he is a hero. He's perceived as a savior, and what we discovered through the course of filming was very much a rejection of the process of the trial that was happening in The Hague. The feeling that actually this is a man to be celebrated rather than to be prosecuted, and that continued is suggested at the end by the complete rejection of the judgment by his son and the defence. And from my experience, that's something that's widely duplicated among Serbs. So he's very much still placed on a pedestal. They feel that the tribunal and the judgment is wrong, and they continue to maintain his innocence. Sorry, I've got a very sore throat.
It's fine.
I'm also emotional, but it's more the sore throat that's causing me to speak like this.
I was struck by how incredibly balanced it was, and how you managed to get access to everybody, to both legal teams and to the families. How did you do that? I mean, how did you? It's quite a job.
I'll answer that only because it's my turn. But that's really that was really the Rob, incredible work, and really Julian Mercer, who's the former executive producer in row A, B, C, D. Who negotiated access. And I think one of the reasons that they were able to do it was because the attempt was to try to make a film that showed both sides, which was very unusual particularly for the defense to hear. But I think for the tribunal in general, as anybody who makes films, and there's several people in the audience that do know, that negotiating access is one thing, and then and one only gets so far. When we first started making the film, we were sort of with a minder all the time. But as the years passed, and this is one of the pluses of making a film over 5.5 years, I think people saw what our motivation was. I think they saw how we treated people, and more we were given more and more access and more freedom to move around the building and really to talk to whoever we wanted to. But to circle back, I think it was really Rob's and Julian's outstanding work. And really, at the time when they started the film, because I came in early 2013 and the film started in May 2012, Julian and Rob, on behalf of the BBC, had the BBC's imprimatur, and I think that carried a lot of weight. But I think the largest challenge was the defense, because the defense really feels, and the Serbs that support Mladić feel, that there's a real Western media bias. And again, I think it was really extraordinary work by those two that overcame that.
I think that, as Henry alluded to, one of the often frustrating things about making a film about war crimes trials, and one of the most challenging things, is that they do tend to go on. But in terms of access, it does allow you to spend a lot of time with people, and the approach that we take is always to be sincere and genuinely when we say we're here to tell both sides of the story. We're here to tell the story of the prosecution. We're here to tell the story of the defence, of Mladic's victims, the people that see him as this monster, this personification of evil, and for people that see him as a hero. And the more you spend time with people, the more they appreciate your sincerity. I think for the prosecution and the tribunal, in terms of the access, the tribunal was coming to a point. I think it turns out that international criminal courts and filmmakers have very different timescales. Because when we started filming in 2012, people were already talking about the tribunal winding down. And you won't get access to a place unless they are kind of genuinely proud of the work that they do. And I think they felt very strongly that they didn't want what they were doing in that building, because Mladić was the last of many trials, to be completely lost. So when Julian and I turned up offering to make a film about their work for what would turn out to be the last case, they were very open to the idea. But it did take a kind of very grateful that the prosecution, the two lead prosecutors, were prepared to take a risk with us. I think the defence felt they had less to lose. The burden wasn't on them to prove anything. They were kind of highly suspicious. We were the West, we are NATO, whether or not we would be true to our word. But as I said, the more we spent time with them, the more they realised that we were being sincere. And I think that's, hopefully that's a strength of the film, that it's about a trial. A trial has two sides, and that's what we try to reflect to the best of our abilities.
It was very clear at the end when the verdict came in that you had complete access to both sides. You got this very kind of emotional responses from both sides. Have both sides seen the film? What do they make of it?
Part of the agreement with the tribunal was to show it to both sides, and to the chamber, the judges, and to the registry, which manage parts of the ICTY. And I have to admit, Rob and I were terribly nervous on that day when we had to show it to them. They didn't have any editorial control. They could only check it for factual accuracy, but of course they're all lawyers. And Sandpaper Films, which is really me, doesn't have deep pockets, and obviously the UN does. But there was that agreement, and we had an incredibly intense day where we showed it to the prosecution first thing. Naturally, there was a technical snafu, and we had to delay the screening for an hour, which just, of course, you have another extra hour to sweat. But luckily, it passed through flying colors, and then we were even more nervous for the defense, because you won't notice this, but the defense really doesn't kick its argument off till minute 35 of the film, and we sat there in one of their offices watching, and Rob and I were sort of glancing at each other nervously, watching the minutes tick by, worried that, of course, that they would think this is deeply unbalanced. We didn't get a bite, a crack of the whip till minute 35, but and Branko Lukic, the lead prosecutor, you could see his sort of face starting to kind of get quite intense, which we knew well when he got irritated, and the lights went up at the end, and Rob remembers the quote better than I do, but it was something like, well, it's fantastic, I love it, something like that. So they got to see it, and I think there was one factual point by Branko, which was completely fair, and from the prosecution side, they were incredibly helpful with, you'll see we didn't use any commentary, we just do cards, and you're trying to simplify and reduce deeply complicated ideas into sort of very simple sentences. And they were incredibly, that's where they got involved very much.
I think one of the really gratifying things that I find as a filmmaker, and I think Henry would agree with me, is that when you ask contributors to invest their time and their emotional energy into a film, and particularly a film like this, which took us over 5 years to make, and they turn around and say thank you, and it was worth it. I mean, that's kind of hugely gratifying, and I think the achievement of this film is that both the prosecution and the defence defence both really liked it. So in 24 years, I don't think the defence and prosecution agreed on anything at the tribunal, but they both saw the merits of our film. So we were very pleased with that, and to get out of the defence office all in one piece.
The film focuses quite a lot on the one count he wasn't convicted on. Was that a deliberate thing? Because at the end of watching it, you are left with this. Even though it's quite a definitive verdict, you are left with this feeling of unease, really.
It was very deliberate. When Rob first told me, we sort of got a tip about the mass grave. We immediately thought that's an interesting story, and we've got to start covering that, which we did rather exhaustively. There are many, many more really interesting and dramatic sequences around that Tomaszita narrative. And hands up, Mandy Chang, who's the BBC Storyville editor, who was hugely did work. We loved working with her, and she did an extraordinary job with us. When we first showed her and the two other execs the film, I met Rob went away on holiday, and Anna, who's I think she's in the audience with her parents and partner, did an incredible job. And Anna and I worked for a while, and Rob came back, and I said, Rob, man, so great you took that holiday. We've totally cracked this film. And and then we showed it to the three execs, and I start off by saying it's taken us so long to get here, but we finally have the structure. And it ended, and there was a kind of awkward pause, and it was pretty clear that we were lost. And one of them said, you really need to just focus on the 2 genocide charges, because you have no idea how complex that case is. And you saw how many witnesses, you saw how many days. There are 11 counts. And Rob just said the great achievement of the film, and I thought, God, that sounds a little, you're sort of proud of yourself there. But the achievement of the film is to kind of get a narrative out of this massive material, and it was focusing on the 2 genocide charges. But we felt that second one, which does get airtime, is incredibly important in terms of being a prism through which you can really show the complexities of the case.
To reiterate what Henry said, it's so vast, it's so complicated, so it was really necessary to simplify the trial as much as possible. And those genocide is considered the worst crime under international law, though the tribunal will resist establishing a hierarchy that's not to be offensive to victims, but it's largely regarded as the crime of all crimes. I think what it also demonstrates is, although you look at the evidence and you hear the testimony of the victims, and particularly Elvira Karagic, who appears in the film, who lost whose father was just taken away one day and then found 20 years later in a mass grave, and you feel that there is a sense of injustice. The judges had their reasonings for not finding genocide. They did find that there was ethnic cleansing, that there were terrible crimes that were committed. They did happen, and that Mladić was responsible. But in a judicial process, sometimes you don't get the perfect result. That's the reality of war crimes trials. But it doesn't mean that we should give up on this idea of international justice, and there's certainly trials that the legal process, accountability, justice for victims are things that we should continue to pursue.
Do we have any questions from the audience? There's a microphone coming to you, so we can all hear.
Were you the only film outfit to do this production? And how did you acquired the rights to it?
We were, and again, Julian and Rob, I think the ICTY had never, ever, ever allowed cameras in the way they did for us over 5 years. I think, there were news crews around. I think one of the wonderful moments we felt was both at the opening and at the conclusion of the trial, where you see this sea of cameras. And at one point, our assistant producer said, what a wonderful feeling it was that he could feel them glaring up at him. He was doing some filming, and you could tell they were wondering, how the hell is that guy up there on the inside? And we're all scrunching up here out on the outside trying to frame a shot. So yes, crews came in and out doing sort of news pieces, but absolutely we were the only crew covering that trial or any trial to that extent in the ICTY. And in terms of getting access, again, that was really the two gentlemen in the room here.
Yes, gentleman here.
Thanks. Hello. I just really wanted to say I thoroughly enjoyed your film. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I just wanted to ask a question specifically about the participants or people who were certainly on the defence's side who were key witnesses. It reminded me a lot of Oppenheimer's work, The Act of Killing, listening to people who certainly either participated in or were aware of atrocities being committed. And I just kind of wanted to, there's a real eeriness to a lot of those interviews, and I just wanted to ask what it was like to be present in those interviews, to hear people either recounting their participation, whether it was the driver of Mladić or it was the owner of the mine, talking about those experiences, either trying to remove themselves from those processes, but also feeling complicity and guilt years later. What was that process like to kind of go over those memories and be in the room with those people recounting those experiences?
Well, you could. Well, go ahead.
I can speak about the driver,
Yeah.
who. This may sound odd. I really liked him a lot. I felt a real connection to him rather quickly. And when I interviewed him, I did that interview and filmed that when he's sitting on the hotel bed. I sort of didn't react because I had an interpreter, and there was such a kind of what you don't see in the film is he had come so hoping to get to see Mladić, and he got a phone call right before the interview, which we filmed and decided not to put in the film, where he's told, "I'm afraid you won't have access to the general. You won't get to see him," which came as a crushing blow to him. And so then when we moved into the interview, the atmosphere in the room was just very intense. And the interpreter was he'd answer a question of mine, and the interpreter would interpret it. But I felt that was hurting the atmosphere in the room, so I said to the interpreter, "Look, I'm just going to ask questions. You translate my question, and I don't really care what he says, because I just want this to feel like a conversation, and I don't want this interruption to kind of break the spell." So I can't really answer what it felt like in the room, because I didn't know what he was saying. But what I can tell you, and this may sound odd, is I really liked him, and I really liked the defense, and I didn't feel, I sort of didn't feel any kind of conflict in feeling a kind of rich human connection to these people. And I think we both tried to kind of leave our prejudices or understandings at the door when we were with the defense, because we really wanted the film to be a process of discovery, and we wanted to be sort of as objective as we possibly could.
I think in sadly all instances of genocide and ethnic cleansing and war crimes, you have people that actively participate in those crimes, and you also have people who stood by and chose to look the other way. You have the mine director who, again, I liked, I spent some time with, who seemed to show genuine remorse, and I think that really answers that question about how people can look the other way, which is that first and foremost he wanted to save his family, and I hope the film does ask questions about the human condition and make people think about what they might do in that situation. But we shouldn't be just dismissing people, because if you do that, you really miss out on an opportunity to learn something useful from something so terrible.
Right at the back there, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, very much following on from what you were just saying about other people involved in it. Almost the last thing that is said by somebody in the Mladić camp is about that, the injustice because nobody, and I'm quoting, roughly that, nobody else has been on the other side has been charged and so on, which is about the only thing in the film that mentions about other people being tried. And obviously I understand how you can't do everything, but is that statement even true? I thought there were people, some people on the Muslim side who have been tried and convicted of crimes, but maybe by different tribunals.
I think that I'm not an authority in all the other trials. There are also trials that go on in Bosnia and Serbia as well. The most high-profile defendants end up at the tribunal, and certainly there was a leader of the Muslim paramilitary outside Srebrenica, a man called Nasaric, who was prosecuted at the ICTY for crimes against. He led his soldiers into Serb villages around Srebrenica on raids, and murders were committed, and he was prosecuted at the ICTY, but he was eventually acquitted. I think the Serb side would say there was certainly an imbalance in terms of which people from which ethnicities have been held accountable and prosecuted. But I know that the tribunal has made efforts to prosecute those who committed crimes against Serbs as well.
Do we have time for one more? One more. Maybe this lady down at the front. I feel that we haven't gone to the front.
Can you fire that over there?
Sorry.
Right. So when you approached, when you had the idea to do this project, did you heard about the trials and you decided to focus on the trial, or you were interested in Mladić and the trial came with it? Because it seems to me that if you went to the trials and you found these other people and then you kind of got your own angle on some of those characters, it must have been quite tempting to explore more, as a filmmaker. And how did you set your own restrictions in what you could find out and what you could add to the situation and to your film? Does that make sense?
Sort of. I'll sort of take a crack at it, and then Rob can pick up. I think the focus was always initially on the trial, and the trial was always going to be the spine of the film, and the narrative that drove you through the film. Watching it tonight, I realized, when we sort of lost our way, I think we sort of forgot that just the chronology of the trial gives you the spine, and that was incredibly useful because the film, for me, it's been the hardest film to ever cut because there isn't a natural narrative, quite honestly, and we had so much material, and I think we had a lot of material partly because we co-directed it, and we were making other films at the same time, and usually it's the first film I've ever co-directed. I've always made my own film, and as you make a film, you kind of figure out what the film's about as you make it, particularly observational films. And in this case, because we were kind of passing the baton back and forth, and there were times, as I mentioned in the introduction, where we couldn't go film, so Nick Holt, who's here somewhere, did an extraordinary job, and Rob, who's kind of more the editorial brain of the film, would kind of brief Nick and whoever else went out and say, this is what we're going to try to get, and these are the kinds of questions to ask. And we probably got so much material partly because of that process, that we were juggling small children, our lives, other films, and so you didn't have this kind of, at least from where I sit, you didn't have this kind of, with a film, you usually you shoot a lot at the beginning, and then you shoot less and less and less and less as the film becomes clearer and clearer to you. We didn't we didn't shoot less and less and less. We ended up with sort of 430 hours of material, which is the reason why it took close to a year to cut the film. And we went off on a lot of tangents. And I think, and that's why I think we really ended up making the film, and Anna's here somewhere, our superb editor. We really made the film in the cutting room as a result. I don't know if that
No,
in
no,
any
it
way
does.
answers it.
No, it does answer it. But you could also continue on this thread and make films forever and develop this whole subject.
Would we want to, or could we?
You could.
We could. I think Rob will want to jump in here, I'm sure, but I think we're both ready to turn a page. I'll speak for myself. I think he who spent an extra year on it, I think, would probably feels that a little more strongly.
I think I'd agree with you. I mean, it's an extraordinary privilege to be able to kind of document a trial like this, and to have such access, and for so many people to put their trust in you. But after 6 years, I think I'm perhaps ready to make a film about something different.
Stand-up comedy.
You're allowed to. Will you please join me in thanking Henry and Rob for such a tremendously fantastic film? Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.